Okay.
Oh, yeah, no, yes,
Oh.
yes. She looked back and smiled.
Okay, we're gonna get started, everyone. So today we're gonna be covering some Windows exploitation. The Windows exploitation will start after we give these short messages. So getting involved, it's the end of the year, so get involved before summer starts or before December starts. Hey, it's summer in some parts of the world. But you can join the Discord and ask us anything you want there. If you want to live stream an event that you're doing, just ask us and we'll set it up for you. And then participate in CSG CTF, which is just an ongoing CTF where you can write a challenge and submit it to us and other people can do those challenges. That's the link for it. So yeah, we're gonna move on. The events that are coming up, it's the end of the year, so I don't really think there are that many events on campus that are happening. But as far as off campus goes, Dallas Hackers Association is meeting next week off campus. We're not going as CSG, just people from CSG tend to go there because we like to go there. So if you happen to be there, just message us on Discord and we're probably going to be there too. And then the last rule of events is our new president, Jace, is going to introduce some officers. Can we have a round of applause for Jace? Yeah! Okay, quiet down.
Good riddance. So yeah, I'm the only officer that's rolling over from this fall to next spring. So we have 4 new officers incoming. We'll have the vice president, which is Brandon here. We will have our secretary, Luke, the treasurer, John, and our community manager, Jawan.
Okay.
Yeah.
So can we have a round of applause for our new officers? Okay. Calm down. Brandon is my evolution.
Hey, let's get to the feature.
Yeah, let's get to it. Okay, so I guess we're gonna just start and jump right into the presentation. I don't want to answer the question in the Google Slides, but there's a Google Slides if you want to ask questions.
Answer the question.
I'm good. I'm good. Anyways, starting on Windows exploitation, because that's why you guys came. So this is a bit overview of, you want to continue looking at my, you good? You get there, buddy boy? He's president, so you know. So the overview is that I'm going to start with explaining kind of window DLLs and an intro to like Windows exploitation as a whole, a broad overview. I'm going to go into DLL injections and why you would want to maybe inject into a DLL after I explain what a DLL is. I'm going to be going over some PowerShell, which is a very basic PowerShell, but you should definitely get started learning PowerShell if you want to get into Windows exploitation. Hey, I'm presenting. Stop talking.
Wait, what are the questions? I can see.
Go to the link to see the questions. So what's it called? Then I'm going to be showing a demo of some PowerShell. I'm probably going to do all the demos at the end so that I can do them in one swoop. I'm trying to talk here, people. I'm trying to talk.
We're asking questions.
Okay, and so then I'm going to be going into the Windows kernel API, which I will explain what the Windows kernel API is a little bit when I'm explaining the Windows DLLs. But basically, the Windows kernel API is what you can interface and interact with to get a bunch of information. Then we're going to be doing some exploitation with CSharp. Very basic description of it. I'm not going to go in depth in that either. I wanted to try to cover as much surface area as possible without diving too deep in this presentation because Windows exploitation is really broad. And the broader you can go in learning what the different things are, then you can go deeper on your own time and figure out why are there so many questions. Anyways, so let's get started. So, quick overview of Windows. I'm going to turn the questions off. An intro to Windows exploitation. Basically, assume when I say Windows exploitation, I'm saying you're on a Windows machine. I'm not necessarily meaning you're breaking into a Windows machine to start with, because usually you have some sort of RCE exploit, physical access, some way of getting a reverse shell if you phished it, or something like that. This is after that fact. After you have gotten that level of access, when you're on the machine and you have a reverse shell, you have a shell of some sort, what do? What is the first 5 minutes, for example, you do on the box? Well, just a quick overview. Very, very quickly, you would want to migrate or duplicate the session. There's a Metasploit module for this where you can inject the session into another machine. The reason you'd want to do this is because you don't know if the session's going to crash. You don't know how your Trojan or your payload got executed. It could be in a temporary window. It could be in a process that's very buggy. You would want to migrate and duplicate that session. And also, even if you know that your session is stable and the process that you're running as is really good, you don't know the code that you're going to be running, if that's going to crash your session too. You always want to have a way to get back in the machine. And so it's always a good thing to first, right when you jump on the box, to duplicate your session so you won't lose it. Another thing, right after you duplicate the session, is to check the processes that are running and get some situational awareness. You want to do that because you want to know what's going on the machine, and you want to not just be running blind on the things that are happening. So if you're trying to exploit something that's CPU intensive, and the person is doing something that is also CPU intensive, that might be a problem. So you'd want to wait, and maybe when the user is not doing something or they're just checking their email. Another thing is, like, if you were doing if you wanted to start a keylogger, for example, and you wouldn't just want to run your keylogger while they're typing a Word document of their final essay. Like, I don't want to read their essay. I want to read their passwords. So Metasploit and PowerShell Empire, or a lot of the exploitation frameworks, have things where you can just take a screenshot, take a webcam picture, and even run some PowerShell commands to see the things that are happening. Next is browsing the file systems. I put import files, but I meant important files. I'm smart. But so basically you want to just look for something that's like passwords.txt that has passwords in it. Maybe they have documents of how the network infrastructure is if you want to go further in exploitation. I didn't mention this before, but I'll be focusing on Windows exploitation as far as a single machine. PowerShell can help you pivot through domains, and so and that is a really useful thing. But this talk is more towards when you get on a single machine, what you want to do and where you want to go from there. And then after you've gained information, you kind of secured your line of getting into it. You want to start exploring exploits that you can do and vulnerabilities on the machine. There are a lot of great scripts and tools out there. There's one called JAWS, which is a PowerShell script that will enumerate windows for you. I'll talk about the benefits and the problems with doing stuff like that later on. But second to lastly, leave persistence. Leave it in the startup folder, like we've said before when we did an exploitation talk. Leave it somewhere where it will be run again, or maybe run it in replace a file that is run often so that you'll be able to get back in. Persistence is key. And then cleanup. You don't want to just leave your Trojans and your payloads around, and you don't want to leave scripts that you're running around. Most of the stuff we will be talking about today will be run in memory, so you won't necessarily have to worry about that. But it's always a good idea to clean up anything that you might have laying around. I'm going to look at the questions, but I might regret this. What is Linux? Well, Linux is a Unix-based operating system, and so that's all. If you wanted more information, you should Google it. I already addressed how I misspelled important. So, there's a philosophical reference here. But anyways, continuing on. Windows DLLs. This is a little bit, if you don't know what a DLL is, basically, yes, this presentation is very cash money. So the Windows DLLs is basically a dynamic linked library. It is a Microsoft's way of sharing libraries and sharing imports of stuff. The differences are, there are two different types of DLLs. There's static DLLs and dynamic DLLs. And a static DLL is executed and compiled at compile time, which means you won't necessarily be interacting with that if you're doing some sort of exploitation on a Windows machine and just the Windows machine itself, because you won't really be, you're not breaking into an application, you're breaking into Windows. Now, that can't be said that static DLLs can't be manipulated to help break into Windows further, because some applications might have admin access or root access that you can manipulate and get more information out of. For example, a banking application on someone's computer might have static DLLs that you can manipulate to get a password out of. These are a bit of more complex attacks, but it's good to understand how they work. And then dynamic DLLs are a little bit more about what we're going to be talking about today. That's because these DLLs you can interface with directly in Windows as far as pulling information from them. There's like a kernel.dll in Windows that you can directly interface with the kernel. So DLL injection is where I'm getting at when I talk about DLLs, because when you look at a DLL, the dynamic linked library, you have a bunch of functions, but you don't necessarily know how to run these functions, or you can only run them in a certain run space. And so DLL injection allows you to run code in the same address space as the application that's running. So if this application is maybe running as admin, but the user has access to this application because of bad permissions, you could maybe run injected code into that application to get a bit more privilege out of it. This also helps you in that you're not, when you run code and you're running it in the DLL, DLLs are typically ran in memory rather than on disk. There are DLL files that are stored on disk, but when you're running and injecting into these, you're typically injecting into the process. So you don't drop to disk, which is great, because bad AV just checks disk. They don't check memory. Good AV checks memory, which there are ways to get around that too. So the benefits again are that you can get a bit more attack surface. You know, you don't have as many problems as far as like dropping to disk, having the AV stop you, or you may not be able to go anywhere, and so therefore the DLL can get you a bit further when you're stuck. So DLL injection is a great way of doing that. Metasploit has a lot of great tools if you want to practice it. There's also a ton of YouTube videos on doing DLL injections on applications. Like a lot of times, have any of y'all heard of the thing, something called Cheat Engine? No, yes? Okay. So Cheat Engine basically is a DLL manipulator. It has other functions in it, but you can also manipulate DLLs with Cheat Engine, and so you can change hex values and stuff. So that's one of the reasons why Cheat Engine can change values in games, because you're changing the DLL value. There's a popular game called Guild Wars that actually does, where all of your values were stored in DLLs recently, where they had to fix it where you couldn't change these values in the DLLs. So now let's move on to PowerShell. So I've talked about all these DLLs. I've said DLL like 50 times by now, but PowerShell is where you're going to be interacting with the .NET framework that kind of has all of these dynamic link libraries. What is PowerShell and why PowerShell, for those of you who don't know? So PowerShell is basically a wrapper around the .NET framework. And this is basically allowing you to directly interface with the .NET framework in a scripting language or a coding language. It's not a compiled language, it's a scripting language. Therefore, you run code on the fly like Python. I'll be showing a PowerShell prompt and some commands and how to use them. But similar to running commands in Python, you can script this, which makes it super useful. And it has a lot more functionality than just basic command prompt. You can invoke a lot more things. You can import modules from online. You can run things in memory with PowerShell, which is great. A common problem, though, is that no user that is in a corporate environment really should be using PowerShell. So a lot of the times, vendors will just block the use of PowerShell. People got around this by using PowerShell v2, which was basically the same thing as PowerShell, but named PowerShell v2. So all these applications went out there, and that was blocking PowerShell.exe, and there was just PowerShell v2 that you could run. That's one of the ways around that. Another thing is using C#, which we'll get into later. So some PowerShell commands that you might want to get familiar with. And these are some basic commands, but I highly recommend you go to look on Microsoft's documentation. Microsoft is really great about providing documentation for their entire kernel and like the way their kernel works and how you can develop around it, because it's meant to be like for developers to learn, but it also makes it really great for us because we can use that as an exploitation way. So the way that the typical PowerShell command or structure is, you have a get, set, invoke, import in the front, which does either a get, a set, or an invoke or an import. Invoke typically runs that command. Import imports the modules in, and get and set get information or set information within the PowerShell command line. When you have a PowerShell window open, typically you have all of the variables that you call are stored in memory. So if you close that window, you've cleared that session. So that is why if you're doing any exploitation, that if you close that PowerShell window, if you might want to duplicate the process, or you want to have it scripted so that you don't lose all of your information. So get process is really cool because it's like task manager in that you can see your process. You can see the process number, how much resources it's using. And then there's a get execution policy, which allows you to see the kind of execution that you're allowed to run on your on Windows. I believe there are 4 different types of execution policies. There's restricted, unrestricted, then I think there is certified only, and one other one. You want to try to strive for unrestricted because that means you can run anything. If you're securing it, obviously you want certified only or restricted, or authorized only, I believe is another one. But if you have user access, you can reset the policy for that individual user. You won't be able to set it for the machine or an admin, but for that specific user, you could set the execution policy to unrestricted, which is the next command: set execution policy, and then space and just unrestricted, or whatever you want to set that as. So it's not difficult to just kind of write PowerShell because it's a scripting language like Python. Python, if you know Python, which I did before I learned PowerShell, it's super simple to translate how to do certain things. You kind of just look up the command, see the parameters for it, and documentation is really good for it too. So another is get services. So you can see what services are running. This kind of this entire slide, or all these commands, are basically to help you enumerate Windows a lot better. So that being said, you can now have all this information to help you exploit things better. Now, I said before, PowerShell is often blocked, so you won't necessarily be able to run these commands in the same scenario or the same thing that you're doing as far as a command prompt goes. So then that's why we have C#. It's a compiled language, which means they can't block it unless they block executables, in which case you're going to need a lot more advanced techniques than this. But so C#, you can interface with what is called the Win32 API. The Win32 API is basically giving direct calls to the Windows kernel, and that allows you to get a lot more information that you might not be able to simply because a lot of people just don't restrict those applications that are running. You can obfuscate your code so that AV might not be able to catch the executable that you're running, and it's just a lot easier to evade AV whenever your code is compiled rather than when it's PowerShell, because PowerShell is often not obfuscated. Although there is a tool that I will link that is called invoke obfuscation, which basically does what it says, in which case it obfuscates your PowerShell, which actually does get around Windows Defender, which is often the choice of AV for a lot of small companies. So invoke obfuscation is a really good tool.
What is that? I'm sorry.
Invoke obfuscation.
Where is that? That's part of the Win32 API.
Oh no. It's on GitHub. If you search invoke-obfuscation on Google, it's on a giant GitHub repo. It's also in I believe it's also included in PowerShell Empire as their like base modules. But here I linked specifically to a place called Power Tools. These are all tools written in C#, and they basically allow you to do things that you would normally do in PowerShell or Metasploit or something of that nature, and have it compiled to where AV might not be able to catch it. Now, disclaimer, all of these are online. So what does that mean? AV has already caught and signaturized all of these. But what you don't know, or what they don't know, is if you change variable names around, if you move functions, if you add functions, if you just kind of change the code around so it doesn't look exactly the same, you know, like if you copy code off of a friend, which you should never do, and you change it around so the algorithm doesn't catch that you're copying, that's basically what you want to do to the AV. Now that all of this is said, I kind of want to give, I kind of sped through this really fast. So is there any like questions that are legitimate questions that aren't about doing surgery on grapes, or if someone can have Alan's number?
That's mine.
It's true.
So I don't.
Yeah, there's a real one. It's the one about what brand is your shirt.
It's Gucci. Okay, well I don't see any like.
What files are imported that lead to further exploitation?
What was the question?
What files are imported that lead to further exploitation? So you're talking about DLLs.
Oh, okay. So there's a kernel.dll that'll allow you to like pull information directly from the kernel. There's also an ntdll.dll, which allows you to like grab more information from Windows, and those can be directly imported from C#. So it's a simple statement of just importing that DLL into your C# code, and then you can Google or you can find the help page of basically all of the functions that those DLLs have, because it's a library after all, and it's well documented enough to where you can just pull functions out of that and get information so that your code can be a little bit more situationally aware. Does that make sense? Am I going a bit too fast? I'm trying to get, a broad spectrum here. Okay, everyone good? No questions? Okay, cool. So, yeah, we're that one. No, I'm not done yet. So I accidentally pressed the next button. But so I'm gonna be doing a demo really quickly. Basically, what I have here, if I can type my password in, cool. What I have over here is a basic Metasploit session, and I wanted to show kind of the steps that I go through on breaking into a box, and maybe if I have 5 minutes, what I would do. So if I type, so this is the sessions that I have. I have a session, a interpreter session that I popped using PowerShell. Actually, if I go over here and you can see that basically when I generated a PowerShell script that will give me a reverse shell, and it's a bunch of just like hex, I believe that's hex code, and that is encoded or obfuscated so that it doesn't just look as plain text as giving me a reverse shell. But that's not very encoded. That's just kind of what MSF Venom spits out and gives to you. Another thing to say though is that because it's a PS1 script, I can have it to where there is a module called invoke web request and then execute web request. So what that means is that I can invoke a web request to pull down a payload from online, so off the internet, and then I can run that in memory so it never hits disk. Right now I have it saved on disk because I didn't want any network issues. But if you wanted to, and you had access to machine and you wanted to import maybe the tools I was talking about before, you can simply give it the URL, invoke the web request, and store that web request in memory, then execute that web request. It's actually really easy because PowerShell has it all laid out for you. And then a step further into that is, instead of just running it straight in PowerShell, you call all those functions in C# and compile that as your payload or your, yeah.
You know if people are looking for invoke web request? Because I feel like that's not a super
Yes.
commonly used feature.
Invoke web request, if you're running it straight from PowerShell, would be monitored, but the problem is that PowerShell, you can't necessarily monitor the PowerShell command itself. You can just monitor the activity that PowerShell is happening. And there's a lot of great articles and like great research on that people have done where they have made PowerShell look like it's acting as normal traffic, like edge traffic, because PowerShell was supposed to emulate, is to script things with Microsoft Edge or for developers to use. So you can kind of emulate that the web request is acting like a web browser and just pull the payload off like that. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thanks.
So, if I understand this right, you can do the invoke web request, and within your session, that's just held in memory
Yeah.
On the attacker machine or the
on
other?
the local machine.
The local machine. So like let's.
That's like worse than curling into like shell, because you can just have that loaded into PowerShell, right?
I don't understand the question. I don't understand what you're saying.
Just trying to, like, if I run the invoke and invoke web request, execute web request, to say like to load in PowerShell and Pyre's libraries, and then I have a prompt again. Are those still in memory? Can I still invoke those, or do I have to do it all in the same?
If there's like a prompt for the PowerShell code that you're invoking, typically speaking, it won't run as smoothly because you're running it in memory. You won't be able to interact with it. So you'll want to run things that run automatically that you don't need a prompt with, or you don't need information be sent with. Does that make sense? Does that answer your question? Yeah. So like when you're running PowerShell code from the internet and you run it on the machine and you execute it in memory, all of that is done behind the scenes in a process rather than being able to see. So if you look here actually, and it says run once or don't run, if your execution policy is set to unrestricted, that prompt won't even pop up. So whenever you run your code in memory, and like let's say we don't have any AV, Windows Defender wouldn't catch this. I don't believe, but if you run it in memory and you execute it in memory, it'll just execute until it hits that hanging point where it asks for the prompt, and then it'll hang. It won't let you do anything. So does that make sense to everyone? Cool. So now that I have this session, and I have a Metasploit session, which a lot of pen testing firms use still. So I can go into the session 1, and there's a lot of useful tools that I can do. One tool that I've noticed a lot of people using, or one tool that I've noticed that it's very helpful when doing these kind of things. It's a bit louder, but you won't need to worry about that too much. As far as if you have a Metasploit session, chances are this won't make you get caught. So it's called Local Exploit Suggester. If I search it, search local.
You got a star at the end of it, probably.
I'm just gonna use local multi. Okay, this is. Oh, dude, you're right. Background. Before I leave the interpreter session, there's a cool thing called migrate. So if I type in PS, I can see all the listings of all the processes that are running and what they're running as. If I wanted to, for example, if I see that there's a system application and I want to go into that system application, like let's take 1400 for example, I can migrate into 1400 and then hopefully it'll migrate. And it migrated successfully. And you notice that that PowerShell window closed because I was still running my session in that PowerShell window. Had that PowerShell window closed before I migrated my session, I would have lost my session. So that's why it's always good to duplicate and migrate your session so that you can't really be slowed down by someone closing a window or a process crashing. So now I'm in that session.
And can you explain, so duplicating the session is just copying that?
So it's like the code that you ran that executes, that calls back to your reverse payload.
Yeah.
Basically, you're taking that code that is running in a certain process on that machine, you're copying it, and you're putting it into another process. Or, in this case, what I did was I just moved the code rather than copy it. I move the code over to another process so that it is no longer in that process, and that process can end, and then I'm in this session. So if I background this and I search for local exploit, there's this tool. So if I copy it and I spelled options wrong. I can see that it basically just asks for a session. And can everyone see that, by the way? It might be a little small. You good? Okay. So it asks for a session, and all you have to do is provide it with the interpreter session, and it has to be a interpreter session. There is also a Metasploit module for upgrading your regular shell to a interpreter session. It's a little louder, a little buggy, but if you need to use this, then that is definitely an option for you. So if I set session to 1 and I run it, basically what it's going to do is it's going to pull as much information from the Windows machine as possible and give you suggestions on what it thinks is vulnerable to vulnerable on the machine. And it'll tell you also if the thing that you're running is vulnerable, maybe vulnerable, or appears to have been vulnerable but patched. So there's a lot of different settings for it. For example, this one, the SC elevator, it says the target appears to be vulnerable, but then, for example, this exploit says the target is running the service but could not validate that it was vulnerable to the actual exploit. So you want to take these things into consideration. I know for a fact that some of these exploits will be run in a certain one-liner that Metasploit gives you when you have an interpreter session. So if I do sessions 1 and I do get system and press enter, and basically what it's going to do is it's going to try 5 things, basically injecting into other processes, migrating. It's going to be trying to pull, impersonate, so it's going to be trying to do a lot of different things, but it failed, which this is actually a good indicator that it said that access was denied, not that it crashed, which means that we just need to migrate into a process that may give us that the privilege that we need. So if we check the processes again, we can see that there is one system user, so we would want to maybe migrate into another session. So let's do 1360 and see if that works. So migrate 13. Insufficient privilege. So what I might have done, which migrate. What I might have done is when I migrated originally, this is also another good thing that I should note, is when I migrated originally, I migrated into a session that had less privilege than the one that I originally had. So which basically means that I can't do a lot of things because of that. Which if you go back to what I said before, is you always duplicate your sessions. Because I'm a smart duckling, I can just go to, I can open up PowerShell again, go to my downloads folder, and then I can run. So I got another session. So background. And then I can do PS again. And you see, we're back to where we were. This is what it's supposed to show when you have a little bit more privilege. So we know that the 1400 process that I originally migrated to is no bueno. So let's see what happens if I try to get system as the current process that I'm running. So if I get system, then it says that it was able to inject into another, it says it was able to inject in memory into another process to get me root access or administrative access. So if I do a shell and type who am I, or who, what's the thing for Windows to see who you are?
Who am I? You just typed it wrong. You said whom am I?
Oh.
Whom I?
Yeah. So whom am I? But it says I'm system, which is basically was our end goal to get to system. This is what some of the things I would do when your first 5 minutes on the box. If I exit this and background I can also search for inject, and I think that, yeah, there's another thing called reflective DLL injecting. There's a module, so after I've already exploited, if I've kind of run out of things to do and I've noticed that maybe I want to inject into another process or into a DLL, I can use the Metasploit module to inject into the next DLL. But that's basically it for this presentation. You have a question? Yeah.
Yeah, a couple minutes ago you said firms are still using it. I didn't. You were talking. I think.
Oh, Metasploit?
Yeah, I didn't understand that.
So I was basically saying that like people like security professionals still use Metasploit as their way of testing, doing pen tests on companies. Versus like.
Homegrown tool sets or.
Yeah.
They're professional, professional
Yeah.
kind of stuff you can get as an alternative to Exploit.
Yeah, there's like Cobalt Strike, which is
Right.
paid for. There's Core Impact, and then there's like PowerShell Empire, which is open source, which I mentioned before.
Is there a paid version of Metasploit too?
Yeah, the
It's
paid
a whole Rapid7
is a huge company. Yeah. So I'm saying that like this is still what is used professionally.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Question super late, but I was trying to find an answer for it myself. When it's enumerating the box, the Windows machine for vulnerabilities, do you know how it's doing that?
So when are you talking about like the script I said, the PowerShell script I was talking about?
No, the local exploit suggester, how does that actually work?
Oh, the local exploit suggester basically has a bunch of signature. So each exploit has like a signature of what it needs to run, and it just checks those requirements. So some of those are written in a compiled code that it drops into memory, runs that memory, and then pulls that information out. Some of them are as simple of just checking different environmental things, like for the Eternal Blue scanner, all it does is it checks the version of Windows and the patch number and sees if the Eternal Blue patch is on the machine.
Thank you.
No problem. Does anyone else have any questions? Because that is basically, or they want to see anything else? Because that's all I had for
There's a
this.
couple in the Q&A.
Oh, there is?
There's one, how much of this is applicable to Mac OS?
Okay, so Mac OS is a lot different, like basically in every way. It's Unix based, so this has nothing to do with Mac OS. I don't mean to say that in a condescending way. I simply mean to say that like this is not applicable to Mac OS. When you want to write, I'll give a like brief description of breaking into Mac devices, but you have to compile it on a Mac, the code you want to run, and it is a lot more difficult than just running CSharp or running C++ or getting an executable or running PowerShell. You have to kind of create an executable for Mac OS that can be run, or in developing it in Mac. I'm not an expert at Mac OS because like not a lot of companies I've broken into have had Macs.
Yeah, but it's like just in general, if you're doing Linux exploitation, you're probably going to be able to do Mac exploitation to an extent. To an extent.
Yeah.
If you're really getting into it, there's some security features that Mac offers that are not on Linux systems. And there's some neat DEF CON talks on those, like application firewalls and stuff like that.
Yeah.
But generally speaking, the very basic steps of enumeration and checking for vulnerabilities will be similar.
Yeah.
They just open sourced their entire OS as well. I don't think iOS is open source. I think just like
Did they open source their kernel?
OS. Yes, the OS 10 is now.
Oh, nice. Well,
Yeah.
there'll probably be a ton of bugs and exploits that will pop up.
Is it just the kernel, or do they have the?
I don't know. It's a good question.
Because I know like they don't use
It's
the
a
GNU
micro.
tools like.
They don't use the left.
They don't use like they don't use, like the GNU tools.
Yeah.
GNU utils, they don't use those.
It's a microkernel. It's a set of microkernels, I think. So it's not. It's a totally different environment.
There's another question. How exactly does migrating to another process work under the hood?
So migrating process under the hood is basically, the way I understand it is that there's memory space for a process, and it's just adding code to the end of the memory space or the beginning of the memory space. Or it's injecting directly into the application as far as like putting code into a field or into the process. I can't think of the word, but it's injecting code directly into the like link the path, so that another application is running at the end of the path. There's a lot of different ways to inject into processes. I don't exactly know how the way that the Metasploit does it. But you can do DLL injection. You can do end of memory injection. You can pipe commands in. You can even just create your own process and then merge the two processes together or join the two processes together. So there's a lot of different ways, but that ends up hanging the process you injected into. It's really hard to check for questions when so many people put a lot of bad questions.
Read one bad
We
question.
have a lot of questions. Man.
Why am I using PS1 when there's a PS4 now? Well, you see, I'm not talking about PlayStation here, because PC is where it's at.
The real question is, have you ever washed the hat?
Do I wash the hat?
Have you ever washed the hat?
Of course I wash the hat. No, I don't wash the hat. Why would I wash the hat?
It's
It's a hat. You wash your hats?
Imagine you put it on, it does your hair for you. It's got all oil in it.
Going for the greaser look.
I have a question.
Yeah.
So if you weren't going to use Meterpreter, what would be your tool chain for attacking?
What is the tool chain I would use if I wasn't using Meterpreter? Well, if
And
I...
Metasploit, my bad. Meterpreter and Metasploit.
Okay, Metasploit. Okay. So if I'm going for custom solutions, I'd write my own. I would try to like write my own C2 server, which I have done. So it's really helpful when you're trying to avoid AV. It's not hard to write your own C2 server. You can write it in Python, C++, anything that handles communications. Basically, you're just looking at infilling and exfilling data from two sources.
What is a C2 server?
A command and control server.
Oh, gotcha.
So just like anything, like Meterpreter is basically a command and control framework. Or Meterpreter is technically the communication between the two links. Metasploit is the C2 or is the exploitation framework around that. If I didn't have enough time to like write my own or do research for my own, I'd probably use PowerShell Empire, because it's and I'm doing Windows exploitation specifically. PowerShell Empire is really good as far as evading it. It uses HTTPS rather than just its own Meterpreter. Meterpreter hasn't been updated since 2008, so it's caught by a lot of things. Metasploit has been updated every week. Like, it's updated nightly, basically. Meterpreter is the connection between the two links. It's the data that's being sent through the pipe. That hasn't been updated in a while, as far as the Sans paper I read. So
That's true. It's written in C and you can read it in the source code.
yeah, it's pretty old.
Metasploit using some other kind of connection.
Yeah, so you can, in Metasploit, there are a ton of different, if I like open this up real fast, you can search, so there is use payload Windows, there's like tons of different, like Windows DLL injected sessions, there is download exact payloads, there's a ton of different payloads you can use. Reverse TCP is the most common, then reverse HTTPS now is more common, because TCP is like, why is there a TCP connection on my network? HTTPS is more common traffic. You can have UDP, you can have bind ports. There's a lot of different payloads you can have in Meterpreter that you can also have in PowerShell Empire too, if you so choose to use that instead. But yeah, so if I go back to the thing that my friend Nick added. But basically